We have two workshops this afternoon. The first one is on the Vancouver Homelessness Plan and our Transportation Improvement Program. City Manager, you want to start us off?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Homelessness is an issue and a challenge facing communities across the nation, probably more pronounced on the West Coast, up and down the West Coast, and we see it with our neighbors to the south and to the north, and we're also seeing it here in Vancouver. We recently had a new talent join the city, Jamie Spinelli, as our homeless response coordinator. She's been working over the last couple of months to develop a response plan for the city of Vancouver to help mitigate the impacts of unsheltered individuals in our community. I do want to emphasize, and you'll hear this multiple times, I think, throughout the presentation, that the city of Vancouver and Clark County are engaged in a joint executive group that really underscores and reinforces that the county is the lead agency on the regional response to homelessness. So the city advancing a plan to address the impacts of homelessness in the city of Vancouver does not erode the county in that lead role at all, but rather steps into a role that's appropriate for the city of Vancouver and what's happening in the city limits while still participating in a regional response. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jamie Spinelli, who will walk us through the plan and leave plenty of time for council discussion and deliberation.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'm Jamie Spinelli, and I'm the Homeless Response Coordinator for the City of Vancouver. I'm going to be running us through the presentation today, but I also wanted to mention that Officer Tyler Shavers, who's our HEART officer, as well as Brian Potter from Public Works are on the line in case you all have any questions for either of them later. And City Manager just mentioned homelessness is often a huge topic, and there's a lot to cover. So I'm going to try to get through the slides as quickly as possible so there's plenty of time for discussion afterwards. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the actual presentation today, I want to first show you why we're here. So these are direct quotes from community members taken from some of the hundreds of emails and voicemails I've received, as well as conversations I've had over the last few months regarding people living outdoors all over the city. I'm not going to read each one of these aloud, but I'm starting with this today because I want to ensure it's clear that Vancouver residents are being heard. Next slide, please. The most common concerns are the health and safety of people living outdoors, as well as for the rest of the community, trash and sanitation, the livability of Vancouver, fear of ending up like Portland, frustration with the lack of a plan or direction in general, but also particularly as we exit COVID. Many have expressed the desire to help, but they feel like the problem has become so overwhelming, they don't know where they could be most effective. And even those who've expressed anger also express compassion and empathy for people living outside. Their anger and frustration largely stems from not seeing visible results from solutions they feel like they've supported or paid for. Next slide, please. At the end of the presentation, I'll have some questions for you to consider to help me determine if we're on the right track with this plan, and then we'll discuss next steps as well as future council action that would be needed if you agree with what we're proposing today. Next slide. So I've already talked about what our community is saying. So I'm going to start by describing the persisting impacts the community is experiencing as a result of hundreds of people living outside within the city, as well as the service gaps that exist. I'm going to explain the city's role in addressing homelessness within our region, give a very brief overview of how the city has worked to fulfill its role and align its efforts with the overall system, and then describe what the city is currently doing to address the continued impacts of unsheltered homelessness. We'll give you a snapshot of the current legal landscape regarding camping to help provide some context to the recommendations. Then I'll share my short and long-term recommendations for additional mitigation strategies. We'll talk a bit about what I think the benefits of adopting the recommended plan would be, the future actions the council might need to take in order to adopt, and then I'll open it up for some discussion. Next slide, please. As evidenced by the first couple of slides, as well as by the conversations I know many of us, if not all of us, have had with community members, everyone in the community is seeing and feeling the impacts of continued and increasing numbers of people living outdoors and in vehicles. There are increasing numbers of tents, tarps, and sometimes even makeshift structures lining streets and freeways. Along with that has come an increase in solid waste, personal property of folks living outside, and biohazardous material, including human waste, needles, and rotting food. In just March and April of this year, the city cleaned up more than 110 tons of solid waste, though not all of that was produced by the unhoused community. We've also seen an uptick in illegal dumping coming from both well-meaning individuals leaving food and items for folks living outside, as well as people dumping garbage and large bulky items like mattresses, furniture, and construction debris at encampments instead of taking these things to the dump themselves. More importantly, in addition to visible impacts, unsheltered homelessness has significant negative and traumatic impacts on those experiencing homelessness, as well as the rest of the community that's witnessing it. We know that some are experiencing homelessness as a result of mental, behavioral, and/or physical health conditions, but living outside can also exacerbate or even cause those conditions after living outside for a sustained period. The Challenge Seattle report, published just last week, which was included in with your memo, noted that one of the many tolls experiencing chronic homelessness takes on individuals is an average 20-year lifespan reduction. Based on information from our community's annual homeless memorial, every year in Clark County, an average of 25 individuals die while experiencing homelessness, with many of those being within the city, and that's likely an undercount. These deaths are caused by things like exposure to the elements, overdoses, and chronic health conditions going untreated or made worse by living outside. Additionally, I think we don't often realize how disturbing it can be to watch trauma and crises being experienced around you. We have community members and business owners who do not have the benefit or the buffer of training and experience needed to help cope with witnessing things like someone standing on a corner yelling for hours on end, someone overdosing in the street, or even someone in a mental health crisis being shot by law enforcement. Situations like these are traumatizing. They can have lifelong impacts, and those impacts are being felt by everyone, housed and unhoused. Next slide, please. Those impacts will persist as long as these service gaps and issues go unaddressed. Our current shelter system is at capacity, and based on information from law enforcement and outreach, there are still at least 500 or 600 people living in tents or vehicles within the city. So we have a significant shortage of shelter space. Many people living unsheltered have untreated chronic health conditions that contribute to their living conditions, as well as their inability to access services and resources. Many people don't leave their camps to access care for fear of theft or even having their camps swept in their absence. Additionally, the process for accessing care can often be daunting for someone who spends the bulk of their time just trying to meet their basic needs. I think it's also worth pointing out here that living through the pandemic has been challenging at best, but sometimes even traumatic for most people. While our unhoused neighbors did not get hit as hard as originally anticipated with positive cases, the pandemic certainly delivered the trauma of cutting off access to most of the resources and supports necessary to meet their basic needs. And much of what we're seeing now is how they're dealing with that trauma. Even if everyone had the ability to more easily access services, our housing and homeless response system is already at capacity. So what we have is a lot of people living outside waiting on a very long list. I know the shortage of affordable housing is nothing new to this council and that it's still very much a priority, but I wanted to note that many of the people living outside not only need affordable housing, but they also need that housing to be supportive. And that's something we've struggled to provide at the scale needed for our population. Next slide, please. To understand why these gaps exist within the city, I think it's important to first explain what the city's role in addressing homelessness is, which city manager touched on briefly, but I'll explain that now, as well as how that role was determined. So last fall, the county and city councils approved an MOU establishing Clark County as the lead agency on regional homeless response, with the city of Vancouver playing a significant supporting role. It also created the Joint Executive Group on Homelessness, which serves as a policy forum to identify system gaps and opportunities for joint coordination and investments to address homelessness and its impacts. The joint group has been meeting regularly since last November, but even before the joint group was established, the city has always been just one piece of an overall system to address homelessness, with others including the county, philanthropic groups and individuals, nonprofits, the faith-based community, etc. To ensure our investments stretched as far as they could, the city aligned its funding and strategies with the rest of the system, as is done in most communities. And that system was largely focused on permanent housing as the solution to homelessness versus shelter or other services like mental health and substance use treatment. I know I'm not providing the council any new information here, but I'm including this because I felt it was important to provide some context for why I'm making some of the recommendations you'll hear later, as well as just call out that this plan is not intended or designed to end homelessness. We know that ultimately, stability and permanent housing is what will end homelessness. But as that Seattle report also noted, we are in a crisis that is calling for urgent action now, and we can't wait the years it will take to build the number of permanent supportive housing units needed to house everyone living on our streets. What I'm recommending here today should not take the place of investments in supportive and affordable housing or be viewed as an alternative to systemic efforts. The city will continue to support the county's larger efforts to end homelessness, but also acknowledges that the entire Vancouver community is being negatively impacted by the continued growth of chronic and unsheltered homelessness. Next slide, please. The briefing memo provides details on some of the ways that we have and continue to address homelessness overall, but as I just mentioned, the majority of our contributions have been housing focused in an effort to remain in alignment with the rest of the system. Some of our systemic efforts have included increasing outreach and shelter capacity, as well as using federal and local dollars to develop affordable housing and fund rental assistance and supportive housing programs. Next slide, please. The city attorney is going to give you some more detail about this shortly, but when COVID hit last year, the city altered its policy for addressing encampments, which really only increased the visibility of what has existed for quite some time. So camps were suddenly able to stay in place, but people living outside also lost access to nearly all of the resources and supports necessary to meet their basic needs. The city responded to that in the following ways. Until very recently, we continued mail service twice a week at the Navigation Center after closing it last year due to COVID. We opened sanitation sites at 6 locations in or near encampments throughout the city. These sites consist of porta potties, hand washing stations, and either a dumpster or regular garbage service. That garbage service is provided by Talk and Trash, as they've included certain encampments and single site camps on their route at our request. In addition to providing the litter pickup service, they employ individuals who either currently or recently experienced homelessness, so they kind of pull double duty there. HEART has been engaging with camps and ensuring that folks living outside are able to connect with needed resources, as well as coordinating sanitation and cleanup needs. Those large cleanups are a coordinated effort between HEART, Public Works, and Rapid Response. I think we've done 7 of those since I started. But that's something that would need to continue as long as we have people living outside. And then we have the Safe Park Zone out at C-Trans Evergreen Transit Center, which provides a safe place to park 24/7 for folks living in their cars or RVs, so that they're not having to park on city streets or frequently move around to avoid being towed. So what I've laid out for you is what our current safety net looks like, with each of these pieces, as well as those systemic efforts, being kind of strands of rope in that net. So I want you to hold on to that visual, because I'm going to come back to it towards the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Oh, now it's Jonathan's turn. So the city attorney is going to talk to you about the current legal landscape, and then I'll hop back on.
Thank you, Jamie. Mayor, City Council, I'll go through this fairly briefly or quickly, as I know City Council is fairly well acquainted with the legal landscape relative to homelessness, but not all of our community members may be. So in talking about this, I'll talk to you about 2 Boise cases, the City of Vancouver's own efforts to update our unlawful camping ordinance, the COVID-19 pandemic implications, as well as a new lawsuit that recently came out. So as council may be aware, in 2019, most cities across the West Coast started talking about a case called Boise. The city's own efforts relative to unsheltered homelessness and the legal landscape actually started 4 years earlier with a different Boise case involving Janet Bell versus the city of Boise. That case arose out of an arrest and conviction of Janet Bell, who was an individual experiencing unsheltered homelessness who was convicted of violating Boise's unlawful camping ordinance. In the subsequent legal challenge that followed, the United States Department of Justice issued what's called a statement of interest, indicating that what they felt the United States District Court should do was follow some earlier precedent out of the city of Los Angeles, specifically a case called Jones versus Los Angeles, that the US Department of Justice urged was the correct legal framework. And that framework was that the court should apply an Eighth Amendment analysis to say that it's cruel and unusual punishment to criminalize unlawful camping at all places at all times within a city if there's not available shelter elsewhere. Again, this wasn't a binding decision. It was just a statement of interest from the Department of Justice, but our office looked at that indicator and urged City Council in 2015 that it was appropriate to revise our own ordinance to make sure that our unlawful camping ordinance was not susceptible to legal challenge and that we're treating our unhoused individuals in a manner that was consistent with applicable legal standards. As a result, in October 2015, this council revised our unlawful camping ordinance, that's VMC 822-040, as well as our unlawful storage of personal property ordinance 822-050, to hold that it would be illegal to sleep on public property only during daytime hours between 6:30 a.m. and 9:30 p.m. And similarly, it would be only illegal to store personal property on city property between those daytime hours. In 2018, and following an appeal unsuccessfully to the United States Supreme Court, we got a later Boise decision that essentially affirmed what we suspected the course of the law would be in a case Robert Martin versus City of Boise. The Martin versus Boise decision held that it's unlawful, basically cities can't criminalize unlawful camping in all places at all times when there is inadequate availability of temporary shelter. If I strike the double negatives from that, what it tells us is that cities can still criminalize camping when there is adequate shelter available. And I get that conclusion from really a footnote from the Martin decision that says that naturally, the court's holding does not cover individuals who do have access to adequate temporary shelter, whether because they have the means to pay for it or because it is realistically available to them for free, but they choose not to use it. So that's the landscape relative to Martin versus Boise. We could go to the next slide. That takes us to 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic, which imposed a few new complexities into the homeless legal landscape. First was Governor Inslee's Stay Home, Stay Healthy order. And a part of that was an eviction moratorium, order 20-19. We're currently on 20-19.6. Now expressly that moratorium does not apply to people who are not lawfully occupying land, but it does create some ambiguity in the legal landscape, and enough ambiguity that the city of Seattle faced a legal, perhaps not legal challenge, but a statement from the Washington State Attorney General's office asking whether they felt they were going to be violating that order when they took enforcement action at the Cal Anderson encampment in Seattle. Another complexity of this is recommendations from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which really holds two things. Their guidance is twofold. First, that if an individual housing options are not available, that cities should allow people who are living unsheltered to remain where they are. So again, largely following the Martin versus Boise analysis. And then a second piece of that, which is that cities should balance relative risks. On one hand, the risks of transmitting disease from COVID, and on the other hand, the risks of living unsheltered and susceptible to the elements. So as we look at the balance of those, we sit here right now in a more restricted setting because of the current pandemic and emergency proclamations and CDC guidance than we normally would. We do expect, in light of recent more relaxed guidance from the CDC, we continue to monitor their guidance on unsheltered homelessness daily. And we do expect that in the weeks ahead, we're likely to see relaxing of the CDC's guidance on enforcement of unlawful camping. Finally, I'd like to remind Council of a recent decision that came out last month. Citizens Alliance for Human Rights versus the City of Los Angeles. This was a significant decision that came out in late April. It is a case out of a United States District Court in California, which means that it's not binding on Vancouver as we sit here today, but it can be indicative of a way that future courts could interpret unlawful camping and efforts to regulate camping by municipalities. Also, this decision has already been appealed by the City of Los Angeles, but it's significant for a couple reasons. Again, first, it may show a guide of what future courts may do. And second, because if this decision were upheld, it would do a few things. First, it would recognize the historic ties between racism and unsheltered homelessness. The decision provides tremendous detail as it walks through the history of redlining, creating color-coded residential safety maps in Los Angeles, racial covenants, unequal public banking and lending practices, targeted construction of highways to segregate communities of color, which exacerbated the racial gap and resulted in Black people being overrepresented in LA's homeless population. The court in LA Citizens Alliance also recognized that there are severe safety impacts caused by unsheltered homelessness, including increased risks of death, mental illness, spread of disease, and gender-based violence. Most significantly, the court recognized that the City of Los Angeles had failed to use the tools available to it, and as a result, the court indicated that it was stepping in and mandating certain activity be taken. Specifically, the court ordered that the City and County of Los Angeles place $1 billion in escrow, with funding streams accounted for and reported to the court within 7 days of the order. Within 90 days of the order, the court ordered that the city must conduct an audit of all funds received from local, state, and federal entities in order to serve and alleviate the problem of homelessness. Within 30 days, the city controller was to oversee the creation of a report on all land potentially available within Los Angeles that would serve for providing shelter for the homeless. The mayor of Los Angeles was required to submit a report to the court to explain why the city had not yet issued a declaration of emergency to resolve the homeless crisis. And within 90 days, the city and county were to offer, and if accepted, provide shelter or housing immediately to all unoccupied women and children living in Skid Row, and within 120 days to all families living in Skid Row, and within 180 days to the general population living in Skid Row. So a massive undertaking ordered by the court. And again, as we sit here right now, that order has been appealed, but it is in no small way an indication that the court is prepared to take, some courts and one in Los Angeles, was prepared to issue a very severe order in order to require unsheltered homelessness be addressed. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions on the legal landscape. Otherwise, respecting your time, I'll turn it back to Jamie.
Oh, go ahead.
No, Jamie, go ahead. I don't see any questions.
So we felt it was important to include that because it explains some of the parameters or limitations that we're required to work within when planning or addressing encampments. And I just also wanted to just to call out that this is not something that we can arrest our way out of, nor has that ever really worked anywhere. But we do have legal obligations in addition to a moral imperative to our unhoused neighbors to provide adequate alternatives to the conditions that they're currently living in. Next slide, please. So based on what the community is experiencing, the current system gaps, and what the law says we must consider, these are the recommended strategies. My first recommendation is a very simple one, and one that we actually already started a couple of weeks ago, which is to contract the mail service out to Outsiders In. I can't stress enough how vital it is to be able to access mail regularly while experiencing homelessness. In February, I started showing up to mail service at the Navigation Center and was quite frankly devastated at how many VHA housing voucher packets hadn't been picked up for several months. I don't know how much any of you know about those packets, but they're super time sensitive. So that was dozens of lost housing opportunities because when the Navigation Center closed, people moved to other parts of the city to be near resources that were open. So many weren't able to easily access their mail anymore. So we've worked with Outsiders In to develop a mail service program that creates 2 different distribution sites, one downtown and one more centrally located, as well as increases mail distribution to 5 days a week, providing greater access to that lifeline. Next, I'd like to expand the size and scope of Talkin' Trash, or another similar cleanup program. As previously mentioned, we have no shortage of garbage and litter to be picked up, so this would reduce the amount of trash we're seeing within the city, as well as provide additional employment opportunities for individuals experiencing homelessness. In regard to expanding their scope, research shows that it takes at least 17 positive contacts for individuals experiencing chronic homelessness to start engaging in services. I regularly hear from people in camps that they see Talkin' Trash and cleanup crews more than they see outreach, and that's largely because we don't have enough outreach workers to meet the need here. So I'd like to add a more intentional outreach and engagement component to that program, which would include some trauma-informed engagement and peer training. So this would increase the positive contacts, reduce the amount of time between those contacts, as well as add to the skill set and experience of the crew members for future employment. In that same vein, regarding outreach, I recommend continuing to build out HEART with a street medicine team or street treatment team. This would be a contract with Columbia River Mental Health, and the team would consist of a duly licensed mental health and substance use disorder provider, someone to address minor medical needs, a peer support or outreach worker, and access to a prescriber. I want to clarify here that this is not intended to be a crisis response team, but a team that regularly and proactively engages with individuals in camps around their healthcare needs. So the goal here is to help people before they reach a point of crisis. This team would provide services after hours and on the weekends, direct access to medication-assisted treatment programs, clinicians for assessment and treatment, medication and prescription assistance, and then that peer or outreach worker can assist with connecting folks with housing and other needed resources. Next slide, please. Next, I'd like to add additional safe park zones that operate just like the one we have running at the Transit Center now, which is available 24/7. We know that there's still a huge need for spaces for folks living in cars and RVs, and that site has been quite successful. There have been some very generous community members that have donated the use of their old RVs and trailers to individuals that didn't have a trailer or any other shelter, or a vehicle or any other shelter. And because of their generosity, we've been able to transition people from tents into RVs at this site. One of the couples that moved from a tent to an RV has now just received their Section 8 voucher, so they'll be moving to permanent housing. We also just helped another young man move from a tent in Burnt Bridge Creek to one of those RVs, and that's provided him enough stability to land a job that he's going to be starting soon. Additional 24/7 safe park sites would reduce the number of cars and RVs on public right-of-way, as well as provide some more opportunities for successful transition for folks living outside and in vehicles. And then similarly, I recommend opening some supported campsites. I'll go into more detail on what these look like shortly, but in general, they would be small campsites spread throughout the city and we would contract with a nonprofit to manage and provide supports to camp residents. These would address the issue of the increase in visible camps and garbage, as well as provide a safe and stable place for people to be as they work on housing, employment, and other services, much like the Safe Park. Next slide, please. And then the final two recommendations are for further down the road, but I wanted to include them here to show or kind of round out the entire vision because they do support the rest of the plan. Because of the number of people we have living outside, I think we should consider a large bridge shelter, potentially around 150 beds. This would also be contracted to a nonprofit for operations. I think we're probably 2 to 4 years out on something like this, but even with that in mind, the landscape for congregate shelter, even post-COVID, is still pretty uncertain. So the possibility is yet to be determined. And then the final recommendation in this plan, and then I'll go into more detail about the campsites, is to revive the community court program that was in the works prior to COVID last year. So this is a diversion program for individuals arrested or cited for lower level crimes while experiencing homelessness. It encourages participation in services as well as provides an opportunity to avoid or reduce barriers to housing and employment. Beyond COVID, the current barrier to moving forward with it is that the Navigation Center was the proposed venue. So with the Navigation Center closing, we'll need to locate another site to hold those proceedings. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to circle back to the supported campsites because I anticipate this piece getting a lot of questions, but also because I think we could potentially work on them this year. So as I previously mentioned, I think these should be small, roughly 20 individual camps per site, but that also depends on location. Because there would likely be some couples, there could be anywhere from 20 to 40 individuals in each campsite. Each site would be fenced for the safety and privacy of camp residents, have sanitation and hygiene services, and be supported by a contracted nonprofit, Talkin' Trash, the Heart team, which includes that street treatment team, outreach, and other community-based service providers. We have 3 organizations currently interested in operating or hosting these camps, but I wanted to mention that I would also very much like for the nonprofit to employ at least one camp resident to assist with daily operations and management. The total number of these camps needed really is a moving target at this point. That really depends on things like whether additional shelter is created, state funding for shelter is made available, more hotels are purchased, etc. And I'd also just like to be clear that these supported campsites are meant to be temporary. I'll likely repeat this many times tonight, but this plan is meant to address the immediate health and safety crisis as we continue to work on more long-term sustainable solutions. We really can't afford to wait on these larger cities that our community members are concerned that we're starting to look like waited. They also rejected the idea of campsites like this for years, and they're now scrambling to open them because the problem has gotten out of control. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a bit about the process for selecting potential sites. We don't yet have what I'd call a formal process, but in general, these are some of the things that we're considering. We'd start by looking at city-owned properties, but we could also potentially partner with other governmental agencies, churches, or other private property owners. Any potential property option should be within a half mile from transit access to ensure camp residents can easily access transportation to services and employment. We likely wouldn't have any more than one in any one neighborhood or within a certain distance from each other. We're also looking at what ordinance might need to be added or altered to prohibit camping within a certain radius of the supported campsites. And I can't stress this enough. This is to ensure that we aren't overburdening any one area. Ideally, we'd like to see them as close to where camps currently exist, if possible, for a couple of reasons. People tend to set up camp near the services and supports and resources that are important to them, just as the housed community chooses where they live, but also because we're trying to avoid disruptions to neighborhoods and businesses as much as possible. We do know that this won't be possible 100% of the time. Some current encampment locations are just not suitable or appropriate for supported campsites, and they're only still there because of current COVID policy. I realize that much of that sounds pretty vague, and that's because I want to really stress that we are committed to a robust community outreach effort before opening these. We want to do this in partnership with the community as much as possible. We've discussed reviving the Homeless Ideas Group meeting as just one place that the community could provide input regarding site selection. We've also started working with the communications team to develop a plan for those community engagement efforts, which would include a Be Heard Vancouver page, which is ready to launch tomorrow if this is something the council feels good about. I'll continue to reach out to community members through neighborhood association meetings, presentations, and other community conversations. If this is a plan that council is supportive of, we can bring back to you a more detailed supported campsite pilot program that would include what would be needed to authorize camping on a temporary basis, so without a full code change for the purpose of conducting the pilot, the most congruent zoning for siting supported campsites, more solid criteria for proximity to public transit, as well as considerations for nearby natural resources, and recommendations for number of campsites to include in the pilot, as well as some specific location recommendations. I want to pause here to say that I know a lot of people, understandably, have very strong thoughts and concerns about homelessness and where services are sited. We acknowledge that not every well-intended plan has turned out the way we had hoped, so we're really trying to do our part to learn from previous experiences and move forward with as much community participation as possible. I've also talked a great deal today about the impacts that everyone is experiencing. So to do nothing would mean that we will continue to see what we're seeing right now. Next slide, please. So in general, I believe the result of implementation of this plan is a cleaner, safer, healthier, and more resilient city for everyone. Again, unfortunately, this isn't meant to solve homelessness, which is why housing is not included in this plan. As previously mentioned, the city alone cannot solve homelessness, but we also want and need to be responsive to the immediate health and safety needs of the community as we continue to partner with the county, nonprofits, faith-based organizations, and other public and private entities on those larger efforts. This plan helps us better manage the current state of unsheltered homelessness. It reduces garbage and tents along streets and freeways, increases livability for everyone, increases outreach, and reduces barriers to access in a meaningful way. And I think that it also sets a higher standard for addressing homelessness in a more humane way as a city, as well as aligns with our desire to provide excellent customer service to everyone in the city despite their housing status. Next slide, please. This plan begins to address some of those root causes by implementing some proactive and preventive measures. We're providing additional opportunities for low barrier employment with cleanup crews and the supported campsites, and more equitable access to healthcare by building out HEART with that street treatment team. Additionally, through the street treatment team, we'd be reducing contacts with police, fire, and AMR, as well as the use of emergency rooms as primary care and the very high costs associated with those contacts. I've seen minor scratches turn into amputations and spider bites turn into sepsis because people aren't leaving their camps to access healthcare. Many more needs will be met within people's camps, which is more helpful for the folks using those services, but also reduces the negative impacts that we saw with the navigation center caused by people needing to travel to and from the center multiple times a day to meet their needs. I believe this plan also supports our current housing system by providing supportive and stabilizing services up front, which will better equip people for housing and employment retention before they get there. Many of these folks are going to be waiting on a list either way, so it makes sense to provide some supports while they're waiting for or working on permanent solutions to increase their chances for success once they get there. I've watched many people finally have their name come up on that housing list, move inside, and then lose or walk away from their housing because the time it can take for some individuals to stabilize and acclimate to life inside is far longer than landlords, neighbors, and sometimes even the individuals themselves are willing to allow for. So to go back to that safety net analogy, as promised, what we're creating here is really a tighter safety net with smaller gaps. So if you imagine the safety net that all of our current and previous efforts kind of intertwine to create, essentially what we're doing with this plan is adding more strands to that net to ensure that the gaps for people to fall through get smaller and smaller with each addition. This is important because the existence of those large gaps is what's causing the negative impacts we're currently experiencing. Next slide, please. This plan also very much aligns with and supports some of the guiding principles of the Joint Group's Charter by creating employment and volunteer opportunities to engage and involve the community. It creates more doors to a system that is working towards having no wrong door for access, provides additional opportunities for funding partnerships. It also facilitates interactions and partnerships with systems and providers that are not covered by the current Homeless Action Plan. And finally, this plan was created with a lot of input and feedback from those with current and former lived experience with homelessness, as well as boots on the ground providers. And then I also included the Joint Group's Charter in the briefing packet if you wanted to refer back to that. Next slide, please. This is just a one-page summary of the entire plan for easier reference. So what we're trying to mitigate on the left, and then the strategy and details as you go along there. I also wanted to take a minute to address the recent concerns that just over the last week have come in due to an article that was written about Portland starting to aggressively sweep camps across the river. So the concern is that we're going to see an influx of folks coming over here because they're being swept. So I wanted to say first that article was somewhat misleading because they're planning for targeted sweeps of highly problematic and large camps. They're not just massively, like aggressively sweeping all camps. They're largely going to be conducting cleanups of most camps, which is exactly what we're doing right now. Second, over the last month or so, Portland City Council has been working on changing their ordinances to allow for the very thing that I'm proposing with these supported campsites. So to allow for some of their public spaces to be used for what they're calling alternative shelter. So safe spaces to camp is what people would be looking for. They'll find it closer to where they already are sooner than we would likely have ours up and running because they've already started. And finally, there has always been some migration back and forth across the river from both sides. I know many of our own people who are in Delta Park and Jansen Beach right now. Many of these folks aren't moving to be closer to services. They're moving to a place that they think that they're going to be left alone. So I think adopting similar strategies in this case would actually help us, because if people did come here, they'd be met with the same thing that's happening in Portland. Next slide, please. So looking forward, these are the steps we're hoping to have completed by September this year. Community outreach will have been well underway. Expanded cleanup and the street treatment team should be launched, and we can have at least the pilot campsites open pending ordinance change and selecting a camp host. Next slide, please. And then these steps accomplished by December of this year. So I want to acknowledge that this is an ambitious plan and timeline, and it is that way because we want to be mindful of getting things in place before the very cold months are upon us. But again, because this is also a health and safety crisis as much as it is a humanitarian crisis. So we're looking to act with some urgency. Next slide, please. Other than getting your feedback on the overall plan, we wanted to make sure you're aware of potential future action that the council might need to do, which would include changes to the unlawful camping ordinance to allow for supported campsites, as well as prohibit camping within a certain radius of supported campsites and other sensitive environmental areas. Next slide, please. So as we move into questions and discussion, just maybe keep these questions in mind. Do you feel like you have all the information you need to support this plan? If not, what can staff get for you? Is there anything particularly concerning or that you feel pretty good about? And is this in alignment with what council expected, or what your expectations were for how we address unsheltered homelessness, particularly as we move out of COVID? Next slide, please. And that's it. I'll open it up for questions and discussion.
Okay. Let's go back. Amanda, if you would take us back to slide 16. I think that's probably a good place to start. The supported campsites, the overview. There you go. Thank you very much. So counselors, let's walk through a couple of these slides, and let's start with this one. As Jamie asks, what resonates? What concerns do you have? Any guidance for further alignment on this particular slide? Anything here?
Mayor?
Yes, go ahead, Counselor.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, Jamie, thank you for your presentation. thrilled to be having this conversation right now and thrilled to have you with the city. You're a great addition, and appreciate the thoughtfulness that went into this presentation. In the interest of time, I'm going to make some comments that are related to this slide, but then just more broadly as well, because I see we have a pretty short time window here. So to start with, to hear that there are at least 500 to 600 unsheltered in our community is disheartening and alarming, to say the least. Looking at the broader proposal, I'm definitely supportive of increasing mail service, talking trash with the enhancements that you mentioned, the HEART team, safe park zones. I'll come back to supported campsites, but also longer term looking at bridge shelter and community court. So aligned with all of that. And when it comes to supported campsites, I think, Jamie, you hit the nail on the head with your earlier comment that this is a crisis that demands urgent action now. From my point of view, it's really important that this be viewed as a bridge strategy and not as a panacea. It must be done in coordination with our ongoing efforts that are longer term in nature to increase shelter capacity and create more affordable housing options long term. So definitely view it as temporary and not permanent. Some considerations that are on my mind, who we contract with and the provisions of the contract as far as a nonprofit to operate these is of tantamount importance. We learned that lesson with the Navigation Center. I do have a concern about pursuing this single-mindedly. There's probably a sweet spot for the number of locations. We should not, in my opinion, be targeting accommodating the entire unhoused population with these camps. I think it should be a modest and manageable number of locations. Based on my personal experience, touring similar camps that have been set up in Portland, such as the Star Wars named camps R2-D2 and C-3PO, I'd like to see the good security and amenities that you mentioned, including possibly providing pallets for people to get their tents up off of hard surfaces and provide more livability, as well as the sanitary services and other things that I'm sure, as well as I was encouraged to see fencing. Would love to eventually see self-governance in these locations. I think that's a really important principle for camps like this, where residents hold one another accountable to the quality of life that they expect, and they have low tolerance for behaviors that are not conducive to safety and overall community. Depending on the number of camps we have, I think it would be a good idea to consider themed camps, such as a camp specifically for the LGBTQ community or other subgroups within our unhoused community, because I think that creates that sense of community. And I also, want to talk about this idea of it being, low barrier at least, and providing, pathways for folks to pursue recovery and ultimately self-sufficiency. What all of us have heard from the community writ large, as well as specifically business community and the downtown, is that what we want right now is to alleviate the pressure of the profusion of people who are living outside. These pressures are well documented in your presentation, Jamie. Visible signs include growing numbers of people living in off-ramps and on-ramps and in our parks, in doorways and on sidewalks, and of course the ecological impacts of all of that activity. So in summary, and again, in the interest of time, I'm supportive of this approach to the extent that it addresses the concerns that we're talking about, and it can be done harmoniously with the neighborhoods, but also, and very importantly, that it's viewed as a bridge strategy to more permanent solutions. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Other councilors?
Mayor?
Councilor Nadolski, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Ms. Spinelli, for your presentation, and very thoughtful in the proposal. And I appreciate your experience with attempting to address the issue that we're dealing with now. I want to echo my colleague, Councilmember Paulson, that I agree with this approach. And I agree with the idea that we communicate that this is just a bridge, that it's temporary. This is potentially a public health crisis. And so I do support the proposal here. I am concerned about safety at these sites. I like what my colleagues said about the idea of themed camps. For example, camps for people in the LGBTQ community. I welcome comments from my colleagues about, I guess what I'd like to hear is what my colleagues think the county's role is as far as these camps and specifically the supportive services. I think they do need to have supportive services, but that's typically a role that the county plays. My colleague, Councilmember Stober, and I are on the homeless group with the county. So I think this is a good proposal to bring to them and want to engage with them about how we partner with the county with these camps. I guess just a side, not really a side issue, but it seems to me these camps would be a really good opportunity for mobile vaccination sites for COVID. And I hope that in the future that we do think about that. But I think it's a really good proposal. I would like to see a public involvement plan, a draft public involvement plan presented to council before it's rolled out to get our feedback on it. But otherwise, I think it's really good, and glad to have this presentation today. That's all I have. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Yes, Councilor Glover, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Thank you so much, Ms. Spinelli, for your presentation. I appreciate the wide angle view that you gave us. I appreciate that it comes from experiences, your experiences, and also lived experiences. So there's realism to what you're proposing. We are in this crisis for many reasons that have all been mentioned, but one of the reasons is in the over 20 years, our community has not built a shelter. And we have been remiss in those responsibilities. And so we're now in a crisis and we need to do some catch up. Parts of the plan that I really like have been mentioned. I think we hear a lot of things from the public saying they want to see, especially the Talking Trash program, grow, that opportunity for employment and pathways for people to get back to be able to support themselves. I'm encouraged to hear the open partnerships, and there's nonprofits that are willing to be involved. They come with experience and knowledge, and it's good for us to bring all those experiences and all that knowledge in together. I think that I echo everything that's been said already. I'm very encouraged. I'm encouraged by the thoughtful way you've gone about this, the time that you spent to put together a comprehensive plan. Is it a panacea? We all know not. But it is a good beginning, a good place to start. And I think our community will feel encouraged that we are taking steps to be able and some planning to make things better for all of our citizens. The thing that I think that the city is most responsible for is keeping all of our citizens safe, those that are housed and those that are unhoused, and also making sure that we keep our city clean. And so these, you have all those things included, and I'm very encouraged and look forward to working with you in the future and making this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilors? Yes, Councilor Fox, go ahead.
Hi. So I have kind of a more detailed question just about the campsites. My first thought was when I saw the deadline of having 3 supported campsites open by December was maybe a little more information needed on when it is cold outside and we have now known supported campsites. Do these include some sort of warming shelters? Is that something that we're thinking of? Because in my mind, it seems like if we're setting up campsites when an extreme weather situation hits, that's the last place that we would want everybody to be. So if you could I know it's a fine level detail, but I'm a little concerned about that detail.
Sure. So, I mean, there are many options. Heating sources is a possibility. We've also talked about looking at other kind of like those tiny pod models that are more insulated. So these could be tent camps. We could have some pallet shelters. We could have there's a plethora of options out there. We were really just trying to see if this is it a concept that the council and the city is interested in, and then we can start exploring those fine details. But yes, that would absolutely be something we would look into.
I'm definitely in support of moving forward with your overall plan for supported campsites. I know from hearing from the community that one of the biggest concerns they have is seeing, campsites pop up and then they're like, well, where do they use the restroom? And then the trash that follows. And so I think in that way, it really does address some of those just humane, ways of treating our own people in our community. So thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hanson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, let me say I'm supportive, and Jamie, you've done a fabulous job of putting this together, and I'm really impressed with what you have so far. And thank you for addressing chronic homelessness, because it seems like a lot of what we talk about is affordable housing, which is very much needed in the community. But chronic homelessness is what really everybody sees. And when everybody says, hey, look, we don't want to be Portland, that is really what they're saying. The graffiti and the trash as well. And then, of course, more efforts in cleaning up trash is definitely welcome. Couple questions. First off, who pays for this? Is this just the city? What I would see the county having a role in this as well, as far as a financial role. And also, when I look at total cost per camp, that's another question that I would have. And the reason that I'm even more supportive of this is when you take the Howard Johnson model at $5.5 million for 63 doors, that's $87,000 a door. Well, if your point in time count is around 916 people in Clark County, that's about $80 million. And if you want to say that there's 500 people in the city of Vancouver, well, that's around $44 million. We need something between now and then to address this issue. Folks are still living in unfathomable conditions. So that's why I see this shelter is even more important to do now. Another question that I have is, what happens when somebody doesn't want to live in a camp? And what happens if somebody is not following the rules of a camp? And you don't have to answer that now, but it is a question that is going to be coming up. Thank you very much. That's all I have, Mayor.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the councilors? Yes, Councillor Stober, go ahead. Okay. There you go.
I couldn't get my controls to show up. Thank you. Jamie, really, really appreciate the time and effort and insight that you've put into this. And I think my colleagues have said some wonderful things, and I'm fully on board with what's been said so far. Want to hit on a couple questions, couple points. New state law. There's new state law around freeway intersections. And before, the city was really restricted in what we could do around intersections. So this new state law has been put into place. Can you talk a little bit about what this is going to allow the city to do, and what kind of our plans will be as this new law goes into effect?
You're talking about being able to clean up on the on and off ramps. Yeah. So the new law allows us to use city resources to clean up on and off ramps, and request reimbursement from the state. So historically, when complaints or concerns have come in about people camping or living on and off ramps or to the side of the freeway, that's not something the city has had the ability to address because we have no authority in those areas. So we remain in contact with WashDOT, but they have just kind of, along with everyone else, due to COVID, they kind of stopped cleanup efforts. So with the passage of that, we now will have the ability to have our cleanup crews go onto those properties and help clean up, and be reimbursed for that.
Great, that's great. So will that be something we'll have a Talking Trash doing, or
potentially? Okay. Potentially, yeah.
Okay. And I'm guessing that goes into effect sometime over the summer. Another question, and this gets down into detail level, and again, one of those things that probably has to be worked out. But as we think through the safe parks, are we also thinking through how we connect people with mechanic resources? Because I know a lot of people who are living in vehicles really struggle. Well, one, they may have gotten into a vehicle as cheaply as possible, so the vehicle was already not in good shape. But then, even if that's not the case, I'm imagining it's very difficult for them to keep up on maintenance of these vehicles. So, are we talking about how we can bridge that gap?
We have one resource for low costs-ish mechanical needs that we can tap into, at least for a little while. But it's definitely something I can start looking into. Just having the space to be able to work on their vehicle has actually been hugely helpful, because it's not something folks are able to do out on the streets or in private parking lots. So we've actually had several get their cars running just at the safe park because they can. But that's something we could look into for sure.
I'm wondering if Clark College and Cascadia Tech may also be resources in those efforts. Some comments. You talked about in ordinance making no camping zones some distance away from these. And I go back to the experience when the Mayor Pro Tem, the mayor, and myself went down to see Alpha Project in San Diego, and it was not in San Diego's ordinance. It was the camp. The camp's culture was, we are going to go out and patrol the 4 or 5 blocks around this camp, and they had more capacity there, but essentially the conversation with people was, hey, either you come inside and participate in our rules and our culture, or you leave. And so as we're thinking through who are our service providers, I want them to have an attitude that they feel like the camp is responsible for the neighborhood, whether or not we have an ordinance in place. So one thing there, and then Councilmember Lebowski brought up, what's the county's role here. So obviously, one, I want to acknowledge that this is a chicken and an egg thing. We needed to see this as a council to be sure we were on board with it before we can present it to the county council or to our colleagues on this joint executive board, but also recognize that in some ways they should have seen it first. So we have this chicken and egg thing, but I know we're going to be going to them next. But I definitely see that we can only be successful, even if we can pull together a lot of these things, those supportive role things, we are gonna have to have the county support. They've got the community services department that knows how to do contracts in ways that we don't. So it's going to be vital for this really to be successful, and we can run with a lot of this. But if it's going to be as successful as it possibly can be, we're going to need our colleagues' support. Thank you very much, and sorry for taking us over our time.
Thank you, and thank you, Jamie, for putting this together. I love the mobile van sites for medical and social services, and of course, talking trash expansion. So based on the feedback I think you received from the City Council, I believe you can now go and begin your broad community outreach to get the feedback and ideas regarding the development of this pilot program. especially for the supported campsite concept, and then use that feedback to start developing a campsite plan, including some potential site locations and timelines for implementation. Any last minute comments, Jamie or Mr. Holmes?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Just following up on that, I believe we are prepared to, pending this conversation with the council, prepared to publish a Be Heard stage page as a first step in that community engagement later this week, as well as some proactive communication through media channels. There was a number of operational questions that emerged from the council discussion. We'll follow up with those with the city council later this spring and summer. And we will, based on this conversation, endeavor to follow the timeline that's laid out in the next step slides on slides 22 and 23. Of course, pending community feedback and further touches with the council.
Great, thank you.
Mayor, real quick.
Yeah, Councilor, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, City Manager. As far as the Be Heard page is concerned, I hope the plans for this are already underway as part of that, but would strongly encourage an FAQ document in light of the nature of this topic in particular. City Attorney spent a considerable amount of time with us this afternoon, creating the legal framework and context. As I know all of us do when we speak to constituents about what can and can't be done on this really important topic. It's really helpful, I think, to have a foundational document that covers some of those frequently asked questions. So I would strongly encourage that as part of our outreach approach. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we can go ahead and Jonathan, just put quick click links on those court rulings if people want to dive down deeper into it. All right. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you so much. Let's go